to another edition of No Free Lunch, Economics for a Fallen World. I'm Jeff Guernsey, and I'm joined by Dr. Jeff Heyman. So Dr. Heyman, when we were talking about demand, we talked about consumer surplus. Now we have a supply curve up there. Talk about producer surplus. What does that mean?
Sure, and I'm going to stand, I'll point to one part of it to help that illustration, but analogously, we talked about with demand, there are gains from trade to be shared. We know that the trade in an economy is value creating. It's always value creating because you would not have any voluntary exchange unless both sides believe that they would benefit. So there's some sort of profit by any exchange that's made voluntarily. At least that's what they think going into the trade. So the question is, the producer surplus and the consumer surplus give us a way to visualize what those gains from trade that each party has. So as with the demand curve, we find that the suppliers have a schedule where they would be willing to provide. For instance, on this diagram, if the price were $2 for this particular good, the producer might be willing to supply a quantity of 2 of them. But it would take an increased price of $5 for the producer to be willing to produce 6 of that quantity of that item. And so what we see is this particular line in the supply schedule actually represents the minimum that the producer is willing to take because, as we said in an earlier video, the resource inputs to the supply schedule have alternative uses, and it would be more profitable if the price were lower to use those resources in those alternative uses. So this represents the minimum, but they are willing to take at each quantity, at each price they would be willing to produce at that price to produce this particular quantity, for instance. So if this is the minimum, that's where they would just be on the hairy edge of being willing. But the good news is, in competition, they don't have to produce only where they're just barely willing to produce along the supply schedule. The only one that would fit that case is that very final marginal producer, because in the competitive market system, there is an equilibrium price that all parties can sell. In this case, the way I've drawn it with this second equilibrium price of $5, all of these production items would be willing to be produced at a cheaper price, but each one would be sold at $5. And so there's a gap between the willingness to produce and the actual sales price. That delta at that particular price is an actual numeric number. It's called the producer surplus. And the overall gains to trade for the producers is the area under the equilibrium price, but above this supply schedule. So we have this triangular area, and you could do the math. If this was exactly 45, I didn't draw it that way. You'd have, if this was 5 and 5, for instance, you have a square of 25, it'd actually be $12.50, we would say, of actual producer surplus. So again, this producer surplus is their share of the gains for trade, analogous to the consumer surplus, and it occurs because the producers would be willing to produce if they had to at a lower price, but the competitive market system gives them an equilibrium price, and they get to have that surplus as well, just as the consumers do with the producer.
So producer surplus has to do with willingness to provide. Consumer surplus, willingness to pay, if you will.
That's exactly right.
Okay, thanks for joining us. Consumer surplus, producer surplus, equilibrium price, all that gets put together. Thanks so much for joining us on this episode of No Free Lunch, Economics for a Fallen World.